Across the limestone ridges of the Judean desert, wind and salt preserved more than fragments of scripture. In caves overlooking ancient caravan routes, texts were hidden that were never meant for public recitation. They were not sung in the temple, nor proclaimed in assembly. They were handled quietly, read under breath, and folded away after use, because they were believed to speak directly into the realm of danger. Welcome to this investigation into the shadowed edges of biblical faith. If you value historically grounded explorations of ancient religion and forgotten texts, you are invited to follow this channel and continue this journey with us. The religious world of ancient Israel was not divided neatly between sacred devotion and superstition. Prayer, law, poetry, and fear existed together within the same spiritual imagination. The people who composed and preserved the Psalms also believed that unseen beings could wound, deceive, or oppress. For them, holiness was not only about praise, but about protection. In the Hebrew Bible, evil is rarely abstract. It appears as a force that moves, strikes, and infiltrates human life. Spirits bring illness. Night terrors stalk the unwary. Calamity is sometimes described as an agent sent, released, or permitted. These ideas were not marginal. They were embedded quietly within narratives, legal codes, and poetic laments. The world was ordered by God, but not empty of hostile presences. This belief shaped how people prayed. Praise alone was not always enough. Words could bless, but words could also restrain. Certain phrases, names, and formulas were believed to create boundaries between the human and the hostile. Not all of these words were suitable for communal worship. Some were too specific, too confrontational, too dangerous to be spoken aloud in public. By the late biblical period, this tension had grown sharper. Foreign empires had ruled Judea for generations. War, exile, disease, and unexplained suffering demanded explanation. In response, Jewish thinkers increasingly described evil as organized, purposeful, and personal. Harm no longer came only from human enemies or divine judgment, but from spirits operating within the limits of God's sovereignty. This development did not reject monotheism. On the contrary, it reinforced it. Demons were not rivals to God. They were subordinate, restricted, and ultimately accountable. But they were real enough to require attention. To ignore them was not faith, it was recklessness. Within this worldview, texts emerged that functioned differently from Psalms. Psalms addressed God. These other writings addressed the threat itself. They named affliction. They invoked authority. They drew boundaries using divine names believed to be effective precisely because they were not casual speech. Such texts were not necessarily written in opposition to Scripture. Many were composed by people steeped in biblical language. They reused phrases from the Psalms, the prophets, and the Torah, reshaping them into defensive declarations. The difference lay not in theology, but in function. The Dead Sea Scrolls offer the clearest window into this mindset. Among hymns of thanksgiving and interpretations of prophetic books are compositions that speak explicitly against spirits of corruption and deception. These texts assume that evil beings actively seek to infiltrate the community and that spoken truth has the power to resist them. The community that preserved these writings did not see them as a cult. They saw them as necessary. In a world filled with unseen threats, silence was not piety. Correct speech, spoken at the right moment, was survival. This raises a difficult question for modern readers. If ancient believers trusted these texts enough to preserve them beside Scripture, why were they later rejected, hidden, or condemned? The answer lies not in their strangeness, but in their power. Words believed to bind demons could not remain neutral. As religious authority centralized, anything that operated outside official liturgy became suspect. Texts once read in fear began to be feared themselves, yet their existence remains undeniable. Preserved in caves, fragments, and later traditions, they testify to a form of biblical faith that did not rely on praise alone. It confronted the darkness directly, armed not with magic, but with words believed to carry divine weight. These were the texts read when psalms felt insufficient. To understand why such texts existed at all, it is necessary to abandon modern assumptions about religion as a purely interior or symbolic experience. In the ancient Near East, spiritual reality was concrete. Illness was not merely biological. Madness was not only psychological. Misfortune was rarely random. Events were interpreted within a framework where invisible agents operated beneath the surface of ordinary life. Israel did not develop these ideas in isolation. Surrounding cultures, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Levantine, shared a belief in spirits that afflicted, deceived, or destroyed. What distinguished Israel was not the denial of these beings, but the strict limits placed upon them. They were never independent powers. They acted only within boundaries set by the God of Israel. Biblical language reflects this worldview with restraint. Certain spirits are mentioned briefly, without explanation, as though their presence required no elaboration. A spirit of terror troubles the night. A spirit of affliction torments a king. A destroying agent passes through a land. These references assume familiarity, not novelty. The audience was expected to understand what such terms implied, yet the Bible remains careful. It never encourages the naming or invocation of spirits. Attention is directed upward, toward God's authority, not outward toward hostile forces. This balance is deliberate. The danger was not ignorance of demons, but obsession with them. Still, daily life demanded practical responses. When a child fell ill without cause, when nightmares returned night after night, when a household experienced unexplainable misfortune, people did not consult philosophy. They reached for words they believed had power. These words were not improvised. They were inherited, tested, and repeated. They drew upon the most sacred element of Israelite faith, the name of God. In ancient thought, a name was not a label. It was an extension of presence and authority. To speak a divine name correctly was not magic. It was alignment with divine order. This explains why many protective texts resemble Scripture without being Scripture. They echo Psalms but alter their direction. Instead of pleading, they command. Instead of praise, they assert boundaries. They do not ask evil to leave. They declare that it has no right to remain. Such language was considered dangerous if misused. Power demanded discipline. This is why these texts circulated quietly, transmitted within families or small groups, not proclaimed in public worship. Knowledge itself carried responsibility. By the Second Temple period, these practices had become more defined. Communities believed that spiritual corruption could spread, not only through actions, but through deception. False teaching, moral compromise, and foreign influence were all understood as avenues through which hostile forces operated. This belief transformed the role of text. Writing became a tool of resistance. To preserve correct words was to preserve safety. To recite them incorrectly was to invite harm. Some of these compositions were copied with extraordinary care. Variations were minimized. Certain names were written with unusual spacing or symbols, signaling their seriousness. These were not decorative choices. They reflected fear of error. At the same time, official religious leadership grew increasingly uneasy. Anything that resembled incantation risked association with forbidden practices. The line between sanctioned prayer and unsanctioned ritual was thin, and it shifted with time. What had once been practical devotion slowly acquired a stigma. Texts meant to protect began to be described as suspicious. Their users were not accused of heresy, but of impropriety. Correct belief was no longer enough. Correct form became decisive. This tension did not eliminate the texts, it drove them underground. From this point forward, demonological writings would exist in two worlds simultaneously. In one, they were treated as dangerous remnants of an older, less refined faith. In the other, they remained vital tools, trusted when official prayer felt distant or inadequate. The same words could be dismissed by scholars and clutched by the fearful. That contradiction ensured their survival. Within the Hebrew scriptures themselves, traces of this older worldview remain embedded, often overlooked because they are understated. The texts rarely pause to explain the nature of hostile spirits, yet they acknowledge their effects with unsettling calm. A presence can trouble the mind, distort judgment, or bring sudden dread without visible cause. These experiences are treated as realities, not metaphors. One of the most striking features of biblical language is its refusal to sensationalize. There is no catalog of demons, no elaborate mythology laid bare. Instead, the writings assume that the audience already knows what it means for an afflicting spirit to enter, to depart, or to return. The danger lies not in curiosity, but in vulnerability. Poetic passages speak of terrors that stalk in darkness and destruction that moves at midday. These are not merely poetic flourishes. In the ancient imagination, time itself carried spiritual risk. Night was not neutral. Desert spaces were not empty. Certain hours, certain places, were believed to thin the boundary between the human and the hostile. Legal texts reflect similar assumptions. Regulations concerning impurity, isolation, and restoration were not only about hygiene or social order. They were defensive measures. Disorder, physical or moral, created openings. Restoration closed them. Yet the Bible maintains a strict hierarchy. Spirits do not act freely. They are restrained, sent, or permitted. Even when harm occurs, it unfolds within a framework of divine authority. This theological restraint prevented Israelite demonology from becoming a rival religion. Outside the biblical canon, however, these themes expand. Texts from the same cultural world, preserved later in apocryphal and sectarian collections, attempt to answer questions Scripture leaves unanswered. Where did these spirits come from? Why do they target humans? Why do certain words repel them? The answers often return to transgression. Evil is not primordial chaos. It is the residue of broken order. Spirits are linked to rebellion, forbidden knowledge, or incomplete judgment. They exist in tension, active, but not sovereign. This understanding reframed suffering. Illness was not always punishment. It could be exposure. Temptation was not merely weakness. It could be pressure exerted from outside. The human soul became a contested space. In such a world, silence was dangerous. Ignorance was not innocence. Knowing how to speak correctly, how to invoke authority without crossing into arrogance, was considered wisdom. This is why certain texts were memorized rather than displayed. They were not decorative. They were functional. To write them was serious. To read them was risk. The gradual emergence of these writings does not reflect a departure from biblical faith, but an attempt to live it under pressure. Communities facing occupation, instability, and unexplained suffering sought tools that addressed immediate fear without abandoning theological integrity. Over time, however, the balance shifted. What began as restrained acknowledgement hardened into elaborate explanation. Names multiplied, origins were detailed, boundaries were mapped, and with that expansion came unease. The closer these texts came to addressing spirits directly, the more they threatened established boundaries of authority. Who was permitted to speak such words? Who decided which names were legitimate? Who bore responsibility if harm followed misuse? These questions did not have simple answers. They never have. What is clear is that by the late Second Temple period, a body of literature existed that operated in the space between scripture and survival. It neither replaced prayer nor contradicted it. It supplemented it, quietly, urgently, and often in fear. These writings were not meant to endure publicly. They were meant to work. And because they worked, at least in the minds of those who trusted them, they could not be easily erased. During the centuries leading up to the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, Jewish religious life fractured into multiple streams, each responding differently to the same pressures. Foreign rule, internal division, and the absence of prophetic voices created an environment where anxiety demanded structure. In this climate, words were no longer only expressions of faith, they were instruments of order. Protective writings multiplied, but they were not uniform. Some were carefully composed prayers that blended praise with resistance. Others were brief formulas, dense with meaning, intended to be spoken precisely as received. Their authority did not rest in originality, but in fidelity. Change was not creativity, it was danger. These texts did not deny the centrality of the Psalms. Instead, they assumed that praise addressed God, while confrontation addressed intrusion. The difference was subtle but essential. One form of speech oriented the soul toward the divine. The other defended the soul from what sought to fracture it. Evidence from sectarian communities suggests that these practices were regulated. Not everyone was permitted to use every text. Knowledge was layered. Instruction was gradual. Spiritual authority was not democratized, because misuse was believed to provoke retaliation rather than protection. This caution reveals something often misunderstood. These writings were not expressions of confidence. They were born of vulnerability. To recite them was to admit exposure. To rely on them was to acknowledge fear. At the same time, they reflect a disciplined theology. Demons were never addressed as equals. They were not negotiated with. They were reminded of limits. The language used against them echoed legal declarations more than supplication. Boundaries were named. Jurisdiction was asserted. Such restraint was not accidental. It distinguished these texts from the surrounding cultures where spirits were bribed, manipulated, or appeased. In Israelite tradition, no spirit could be bargained with. It could only be ordered to depart under higher authority. This framework required precision. Divine names were treated with extreme care. Some were written but never spoken. Others were spoken but never written. This was not secrecy for its own sake. It was an attempt to prevent dilution of power through familiarity. As these traditions developed, their relationship to official worship grew strained. Temple liturgy emphasized communal identity, moral alignment, and covenant memory. Protective texts addressed private crisis. They operated in homes, at bedsides, in moments of panic where public ritual was inaccessible. When the temple fell, this tension intensified. Centralized worship collapsed. Fear did not. In the absence of sacrifice, words carried even greater weight. Text became refuge, but authority had to be reasserted. Rabbinic tradition would eventually draw firm lines between acceptable prayer and forbidden practice. Anything that resembled coercion of the unseen risked condemnation. What survived was carefully reframed. Some formulas were absorbed into approved prayers. Others were stripped of confrontational language. The rest were pushed beyond the boundaries of legitimacy. Yet elimination was impossible. Too many people had trusted these texts in moments of crisis. Too many stories circulated of relief, recovery, or peace following their use. Whether those outcomes were psychological, spiritual, or coincidental mattered less than the memory of effectiveness. Thus, a paradox emerged. The more religious authority attempted to control spiritual speech, the more certain words acquired an aura of danger. And the more dangerous they were believed to be, the more tightly they were guarded by those who still trusted them. What began as protection quietly became taboo, and what became taboo never truly disappeared. The manuscripts discovered near the Dead Sea reveal how deeply this struggle was woven into daily devotion. Alongside hymns of thanksgiving and interpretations of prophetic visions appear compositions that speak directly against forces of corruption. These writings assume a world in constant tension, where unseen adversaries seek access through error, fear, and moral weakness. In these texts, evil is not chaotic. It is organized. Spirits of deception operate through false understanding. Spirits of violence inflame human anger. Spirits of impurity exploit disorder. The language is precise, restrained, and deliberately unspectacular. There is no drama for its own sake, only vigilance. Members of the community believed that correct speech could reinforce the boundaries of creation itself. To speak truth was to participate in divine order. To remain silent in the face of intrusion was to allow disorder to advance. Words became acts of resistance. This belief reshaped how sacred language functioned. Psalms were no longer only expressions of emotion. They were shields. When adapted into protective compositions, familiar phrases took on a sharper edge. Blessing became boundary. Praise became defense. Yet even here, restraint governed everything. The texts do not glorify conflict. They do not dwell on the nature of demons. Attention remains fixed on God's authority. The hostile forces are mentioned only to be diminished, reduced to their limits. What is striking is how communal this struggle appears. Protection was not solely individual. The community understood itself as a shared spiritual body. Corruption of one member threatened all. Protective texts were recited not only for personal safety, but for collective integrity. This explains the emphasis on purity of speech and thought. Error was not simply mistaken belief, it was vulnerability. Deception was not only intellectual, it was invasive. To think wrongly was to open a door. Such ideas may feel severe to modern readers, but they emerged from lived experience. Communities faced constant pressure, from foreign rule, internal division, and the absence of clear prophetic guidance. In that uncertainty, unseen forces offered a framework for understanding persistent fear. The texts do not ask whether demons exist. They assume they do. The only question is how they are resisted. Over time, these writings formed a parallel devotional tradition, not a rival to Scripture, but a supplement activated under stress. When regular prayer restored peace, they remained unused. When fear persisted, they were taken out. This selective use may explain their scarcity. They were not recited daily. They were not copied endlessly. They were preserved carefully, for moments that mattered. Such restraint also contributed to later suspicion. Texts used rarely, spoken quietly, and associated with crisis are easily misunderstood. Their purpose becomes obscured once the fear that produced them fades. As generations passed, fewer people remembered how and why these words were spoken. What remained were fragments, phrases without context, names without explanation. In the absence of understanding, fear attached itself to the texts rather than to the threats they addressed. By the time these writings were rediscovered in modern excavations, they appeared alien even to those steeped in biblical tradition. They did not fit comfortably within familiar categories of prayer or doctrine, but in their own time, they were neither foreign nor marginal. They were practical expressions of faith under pressure. They were the words spoken when ordinary devotion felt insufficient and silence felt dangerous. Beyond the desert communities, other Jewish writings attempted to explain what Scripture left unresolved. Among them, traditions preserved in Enochic literature and related works offered an origin story for hostile spirits that reshaped religious imagination for centuries. Evil was no longer merely an abstract inclination or momentary affliction. It had a history. These texts describe a primordial violation of boundaries, where heavenly beings crossed limits established at creation. Forbidden knowledge entered the human realm, altering it permanently. Violence increased, disorder multiplied, judgment fell, but not all consequences were resolved. The spirits associated with that transgression remained active, confined but not erased. This explanation mattered deeply. It preserved the goodness of creation while accounting for persistent corruption. Suffering was not proof of divine failure. It was residue. The world was wounded, not abandoned. Within this framework, demons were not independent rebels roaming freely. They were remnants of an unresolved past, operating under restriction. Their activity was limited in time and scope. They could harm, but they could not overturn divine purpose. Such ideas reframed daily struggle. Temptation was not simply internal weakness. It could be external pressure. Illness was not always punishment. It could be exposure to forces exploiting vulnerability. Fear itself became a battleground. In response, language took on renewed importance. If hostile spirits operated through deception and influence, then truth spoken aloud had defensive power. Words aligned with divine order countered words rooted in transgression. This belief did not encourage obsession with demons. On the contrary, it insisted on clarity. To understand the origin of corruption was to refuse its authority. Knowledge was not fascination. It was resistance. Texts emerging from this worldview often emphasize restraint. They name origins but avoid excess detail. They explain presence without inviting fixation. The goal is orientation, not curiosity. Yet even this restraint carried risk. To speak of origins was to speak of forbidden knowledge. To explain corruption was to approach its source. Over time, lines blurred. What began as explanation could slide toward speculation. Religious authorities recognized this danger. Some traditions were preserved cautiously. Others were sidelined. The concern was not that these texts contradicted belief, but that they distracted from devotion. Still, their influence persisted. Even when excluded from official collections, their ideas shaped interpretation. The language of unseen struggle, inherited limitation, and cosmic order continued to inform how people understood evil. Protective texts drew heavily from this tradition. They assumed demons were ancient, constrained, and temporary. Their authority derived not from clever wording, but from alignment with divine judgment already pronounced. This alignment explains why such texts often sound legal rather than mystical. They declare verdicts already issued. They remind hostile forces of sentences already passed. They do not invent power. They invoke existing order. In this sense, the so-called Book of Demons was never about demons at all. It was about boundaries, what was permitted, what was forbidden, and what would ultimately end. But as these ideas spread beyond their original context, subtle shifts occurred. Explanation hardened into system. System invited use. Use invited misuse. And misuse would soon change how these texts were remembered. By late antiquity, traditions surrounding King Solomon had become the focal point for a different kind of protective literature. Solomon was remembered not only as a wise ruler, but as one granted extraordinary insight into the hidden structure of creation. His wisdom was believed to extend beyond governance into mastery over forces that threatened human order. Texts attributed to him do not portray a magician experimenting with power. They depict a judge exercising delegated authority. Demons are not bargained with. They are interrogated, identified, and constrained. Each is bound by limits it cannot cross, compelled to acknowledge a higher jurisdiction. The authority in these traditions does not originate in technique. It flows from divine sanction. The names invoked are not secret passwords, but reminders of hierarchy. Power is effective only insofar as it reflects God's sovereignty. This distinction mattered deeply. It separated legitimate authority from forbidden practice. The problem was never the existence of demons, but the attempt to control them apart from God. Solomon's figure offered a solution: confrontation without rebellion, command without rivalry. Yet this solution introduced new tension. If authority could be exercised through words, who was permitted to speak them? Could such authority be inherited, taught, or recorded? Or was it unique, tied to a singular figure and moment? As these traditions circulated, they became increasingly textual. Lists of spirits, descriptions of their effects, and formulas for restraint were preserved and copied. Not because curiosity demanded it, but because fear did. These texts were not read casually. They were consulted in moments of crisis, illness that defied explanation, night disturbances that returned repeatedly, episodes of mental distress that felt external rather than internal. In such moments, inherited prayer sometimes felt insufficient. The need was not for comfort, but for interruption. Here the boundary between prayer and exorcism narrowed. Both invoked God. Both relied on speech. The difference lay in direction. One addressed the divine. The other addressed intrusion. Religious authorities grew uneasy. Even when theology remained intact, practice risked sliding into control rather than submission. The concern was not merely doctrinal, it was ethical. Authority exercised without accountability becomes dangerous, even when well-intentioned. As a result, these texts occupied an ambiguous position. They were neither fully rejected nor openly endorsed. Their use continued quietly, passed along with caution, often accompanied by warnings. This ambiguity shaped their fate. Later generations would remember the danger more vividly than the discipline, the authority more than the restraint, the names more than the limits. What had once been understood as delegated judgment would increasingly be interpreted as forbidden manipulation. And once that shift occurred, the texts themselves would be recast as part of the threat they were meant to address. Yet for those who first trusted them, the purpose remained clear. These words were not read instead of psalms out of defiance. They were read when praise felt distant and danger felt immediate. They were spoken not to replace faith, but to defend it. Material evidence confirms that these traditions did not remain confined to manuscripts or elite circles. Archaeological discoveries from across the eastern Mediterranean reveal objects meant to be used, carried, worn, or buried, each inscribed with words intended to protect rather than instruct. These artifacts belong to ordinary people navigating fear in daily life. Incantation bowls placed beneath floors, amulets worn against the skin, inscriptions etched onto metal or stone were not signs of fringe belief. They reflect a widespread conviction that spoken and written words could shape spiritual boundaries. These objects were practical theology, activated when danger felt personal and immediate. The language they carry is revealing. Many draw directly from biblical phrasing. Others invoke divine names with extreme precision. Some combine both, weaving scripture into declarative formulas that assert protection, separation, and restraint. The goal is consistent: to close access, to interrupt intrusion, to restore order. These objects were often used in moments where vulnerability was highest. Childbirth, illness, nighttime fear, travel. Thresholds, both physical and existential, were believed to invite exposure. Protection was not paranoia, it was preparation. What distinguishes these practices from forbidden magic is intent and structure. There is no appeal to foreign gods, no attempt to manipulate fate. Authority is always derivative. The power invoked is never personal. It is borrowed, acknowledged, and returned. Still, suspicion grew. As communities changed, fewer people understood the theological discipline behind these texts. What remained visible were names, formulas, and claims of power. Without context, they appeared dangerous. Rabbinic tradition responded by narrowing acceptable speech. Prayer was emphasized. Trust was redirected inward and upward. Anything that suggested direct confrontation with spirits risked association with illicit practice. This shift was not sudden. It unfolded over generations. Practices were discouraged, then quietly abandoned, then remembered only as warnings. What had once been protection became taboo. Yet archaeology preserves what theology tried to forget. These objects testify to a religious world that refused to pretend danger was imaginary. Faith was not denial. It was engagement under constraint. Early Christianity inherited this tension intact. The same fears persisted. The same assumptions about unseen forces remained. But authority was reframed. Power was no longer associated with words written or worn, but with a living figure whose presence replaced formulas. Texts once used for protection were increasingly labeled dangerous. Their names were avoided, their use condemned. The boundary between faith and fear was redrawn, but the objects remain. Silent, unembellished, practical. They speak of a time when belief extended beyond doctrine into survival, and when Scripture alone was not always perceived as sufficient against what lurked unseen. They reveal not superstition, but a form of devotion shaped by exposure, and exposure leaves marks that doctrine alone cannot erase. When the world of the Second Temple collapsed, the struggle over protective words did not disappear. It changed jurisdictions. Authority moved from temple to synagogue, from priesthood to scribal interpretation, from local custom to legal discourse. In that transition, the question was no longer only whether hostile spirits existed. The question became who had the right to speak against them, and what kind of speech was permitted. In Jewish tradition, after the destruction of Jerusalem, the instinct was to guard the borders of devotion. Prayer remained central, but it was increasingly framed within communal discipline. Words were sanctified not only by their content, but by their place in authorized practice. Anything that resembled coercion of unseen forces risked being treated as a rival system of power, even if it invoked the God of Israel. That suspicion was not irrational. The ancient Mediterranean was saturated with spiritual technologies. Incantations traveled across languages and regions. Divine names were borrowed, transliterated, and repurposed. Formulas were traded like medicine. Jewish communities lived among neighbors who wrote spells, wore charms, and consulted specialists. Even when Jews rejected the theology behind these practices, the pressure of fear and the promise of relief could blur boundaries. The same tension pressed on early Christianity, but with a different center of gravity. The earliest Christian texts assume a world populated by hostile spirits, and they treat confrontation with those spirits as part of ordinary religious life. The difference is that the confrontation is framed as a sign of messianic authority rather than a craft of specialized speech. Deliverance is not presented as a technique. It is presented as a consequence of a kingdom arriving with power. This mattered because it shifted the locus of legitimacy. Protective words were not rejected outright, but they were subordinated. Authority did not reside in a written formula carried on the body. It resided in the name of the Messiah invoked in trust. That name was not a secret code. It was a confession that placed the speaker under a higher allegiance. Yet even within this framework, the ancient habit of turning words into objects did not vanish. Christians, like their Jewish neighbors, lived close to sickness, childbirth risk, poverty, and violence. For many, theology was not debated in lecture halls, it was tested at bedsides. In that environment, the temptation to keep a protective text near the skin was not an intellectual rebellion. It was an attempt to survive. The Christian movement spread through cities where spiritual commerce was routine. In marketplaces and workshops, amulets were purchased for protection against envy, illness, and the restless dead. Some invoked Greek gods, others invoked Egyptian powers, others invoked mixed names assembled from multiple traditions. In such places, the distinction between prayer and spell was not always obvious to ordinary people. The difference required instruction, and instruction required authority. One early Christian narrative captures the anxiety this created. Stories circulated about people attempting to use holy names as if they were tools, invoking divine authority without submission to it. These accounts are not mere moral tales. They reveal a world where names were believed to work, and where the greatest danger was treating sacred speech like a mechanism rather than a relationship. A name spoken without allegiance could become an invitation rather than a weapon. The same sources also preserve a second image: public renunciation. Some communities staged dramatic abandonments of occult texts, sometimes destroying collections of ritual writings and formulas. Whatever the exact scale of these events, the symbolism is clear. The new movement wanted to distinguish itself from the spiritual marketplace. It did not deny the existence of hostile forces. It denied the legitimacy of competing methods of control. But distinction was harder than declaration. Christian leaders quickly faced a paradox. They preached that God intervened, that spiritual oppression was real, and that deliverance could occur. Yet they also feared that the language and practices of deliverance could slide into manipulation. They needed to condemn magic without denying spiritual warfare. They needed to affirm power without turning it into a technique. This is where a slow tightening begins. As Christian identity became more formal, leaders began policing devotional boundaries with increasing clarity. The problem was not only pagan ritual, the problem was any practice that implied power could be possessed apart from moral transformation and ecclesial oversight. Amulets became a flashpoint. Some Christians wore them with crosses or biblical phrases, assuming that scripture on the body was simply intensified devotion. Critics saw something else, an attempt to bind divine protection into an object, to treat holy words as though they functioned automatically. The criticism was not merely superstition shaming. It was a theological argument about agency. Does God protect because a person trusts and obeys, or because an object is carried? If the latter, devotion has been displaced by mechanism. The debate was not settled by abstract reasoning. It was shaped by fear, scandal, and the need for control. Stories circulated of charlatans who sold protection. Communities faced accusations from outsiders that their exorcisms were indistinguishable from sorcery. Leaders responded by drawing sharper boundaries. Authorized prayer was affirmed. Unauthorized formulas were condemned. What could not be supervised was increasingly rejected. In this tightening, older Jewish protective traditions were caught in the crossfire. Texts attributed to Solomon, for example, could be read as testimonies to divine authority over demons. They could also be read as manuals for controlling spirits. The same material could be framed as wisdom or as illicit technique. The interpretive choice depended less on the text itself than on the authority structure surrounding it. The rise of heresiology intensified this dynamic. When religious movements fight for legitimacy, spiritual practices become identity markers. What one group calls deliverance, another calls deception. What one calls holy power, another calls demonic counterfeit. Polemical language tends to simplify. Nuance becomes a casualty. As a result, demonological writings that had once been treated as practical responses to fear were increasingly labeled as dangerous by default. Their ambiguity became their condemnation. If a text addressed demons directly, if it listed names, if it described methods, it risked being categorized as the very thing it opposed. In the eyes of institutional authority, the safest rule was exclusion. This shift did not erase the practices. It drove them into shadow. When something is condemned publicly but needed privately, it continues underground. People still fell ill. Children still died. Night fears still returned. The human desire for protection does not vanish because a council disapproves. So two streams persisted side by side. Official devotion emphasized prayer, ethical formation, communal worship, and submission to God's will. Shadow devotion preserved formulas, names, and protective objects, often baptized with acceptable symbols to avoid scrutiny. A cross engraved on an amulet could look like faith and function like a charm. A psalm written on parchment could be scripture and talisman simultaneously. The same act could be interpreted as devotion or as superstition depending on who judged it. This is how the phrase, "a book of demons," becomes possible without anyone believing they worship demons. The label emerges when a protective tradition is reclassified by authority as illicit. A text intended to repel evil is remembered as contaminated by it. The tool is renamed as the threat. And once that renaming takes hold, memory changes. The story becomes simpler than the reality. It becomes a warning. People read forbidden texts instead of psalms. They chose darkness over devotion. But the historical record suggests something more human and more troubling. Many did not choose darkness. They chose what they believed would keep the darkness out. They reached for words not because they despised God, but because they feared what might happen if they remained unprotected. In the end, the conflict was never only about demons. It was about authority, fear, and the fragile border between trust and control. The same mouth that prays can also panic. The same hand that lifts a psalm can also clutch an amulet. And in the quiet of the night, when suffering feels personal and immediate, people will reach for whatever words they believe still carry weight. The phrase itself, "a book of demons," sounds like a relic of sensational rumor, the kind of label that emerges when later generations need a simple story for a complex reality. It implies a reversal, people abandoning praise in favor of darkness, choosing forbidden texts over sacred prayer. Yet the historical evidence points to something less dramatic and far more revealing about the human condition in the ancient world. These writings were born in the same soil that produced the Psalms, a world where danger was not theoretical. The ancient Mediterranean knew epidemic illness, sudden violence, infant mortality, famine, and psychological terror with no modern language to soften it. When people spoke of spirits, they were often describing what they experienced as intrusions into an already precarious life. The biblical tradition offered two truths that existed side by side. First, God alone ruled the cosmos. Second, the cosmos was not empty. In the gap between these truths, a practical religious instinct formed. If unseen forces could wound, then faith needed not only praise but defense. This instinct did not begin as rebellion. It began as an extension of covenant belief into crisis. The same scriptures that taught trust also contained language of threat, destroying agents, afflicting spirits, terrors of the night, deception that takes hold of the heart. The canon rarely lingered on these realities, but it did not deny them. It acknowledged them with restraint, keeping attention fixed on God while allowing the audience to recognize the danger. Later texts, especially from the Second Temple period, expanded what Scripture left implicit. They named the threat more clearly. They explained origins and limits. They sharpened the language of resistance. And they did so using Israel's most sacred tools, divine names, covenant vocabulary, and the conviction that order could be reinforced by truthful speech. In many cases, the so-called demon texts did not replace the Psalms at all. They borrowed from them. A protective formula might echo a psalm's language of refuge but recast it as a declaration, turning comfort into boundary. In that sense, the relationship between psalm and protection was not either-or, it was layered. So why did these writings become suspect? Because power, even when sought for survival, attracts corruption. A text used in private crisis can easily become a technique. A name invoked in fear can be treated as a mechanism. The moment sacred speech is believed to function automatically, detached from obedience, humility, and communal accountability, it begins to resemble the wider spiritual marketplace of late antiquity, where incantations were traded as tools. Religious authorities recognized the danger. They had seen how quickly words could be commercialized, abused, or blended with foreign practices. They also understood a subtler threat. If protection can be carried in an object, then devotion risks becoming transactional. Faith becomes something possessed rather than lived. And yet the authorities faced their own dilemma. They could condemn illicit techniques, but they could not erase fear. They could tighten boundaries, but they could not guarantee that people would feel safe within them. The more they insisted that sanctioned prayer was sufficient, the more any unsanctioned practice looked like disobedience, regardless of the desperation that produced it. This is where memory hardened. Practices that were once practical and theologically restrained were increasingly flattened into a single category: forbidden. Once condemned, they became easy to label. A text that listed spirits became demonic, even if its purpose was resistance. A tradition that used divine names became magic, even if it affirmed God's sovereignty. History shows how such labels work. They simplify. They protect institutions. They warn the vulnerable. They also distort. The people who used these writings were rarely trying to worship evil. More often, they were trying to survive it. Archaeology confirms the scale of this need. Amulets and bowls and inscriptions appear across centuries and regions, bearing biblical language alongside protective declarations. These objects do not testify to apostasy so much as to anxiety. They reveal how ordinary believers navigated the thin line between trust and control. And that line remains the real subject of this story. The Psalms teach that God is refuge. Protective texts attempt to enact refuge. The tension between them is not simply theological, it is human. Praise is easiest when the world feels stable. Defense becomes tempting when the world feels hostile. In the end, the Book of Demons was not a single volume, and it was not a coherent canon. It was a shadow archive. Prayers sharpened into boundaries, names treated as authority, fragments carried by people who feared what might happen if they did nothing. Some of those practices were disciplined and faithful, rooted in the conviction that God alone commands the unseen. Others slipped toward manipulation, as fear often does. Both realities existed at once. That is why the tradition could be preserved, condemned, and revived repeatedly across time. What remains, after the labels fall away, is the deeper historical truth. Ancient faith did not exist in a clean, modern abstraction. It lived in the dust, the sickness, the night terrors, and the uncertainty of empire. It lived among people who loved God and still trembled in the dark. They sang psalms in the daylight, and when the night felt too heavy, they reached for words they believed could hold the line.